discussion. I will now hand over to Norman Sieroka, who will moderate the panel discussion and will introduce the panelists. So thank you very much. And this is the mic.
Thanks. So, very warm welcome also from my side. I'm very happy to host this session tonight, and I will say a few words on the topic, and then, as Ela already said, introduce the guests and also the procedure. So we will talk about orality in philosophy, and indeed that's a very old and intriguing topic, because sometimes the transition, especially the transition from an oral to a written society, is often standardly taken as somehow a prerequisite for philosophy, but that's actually debatable, and that's why we're here tonight. I mean, surely to have a written language is not straightforwardly a sufficient condition. If we look at the history, that would be tricky with regard, for example, to old or to ancient Egypt or to other cultures in the Near East who used cuneiform for a long period, but it doesn't seem to be necessary that philosophy follows from that. So it also, of course, depends on what you're doing with language, also with the written language. And then the other question, I mean, talking as a philosopher, if it's not necessary, might it be, if it's not a sufficient condition, might it be a necessary condition, might it be a prerequisite? And there's often arguments saying, well, if you have just an oral tradition, you have severe limits in what you are able to express. Yeah, it's difficult to develop sophisticated thoughts because so much effort always have to go into memorizing. But then on the other hand, you might again think of famous, very old philosophers who, and also of course more recent, who put their thoughts into aphorisms and kind of proverb style, in a proverb style way, so that there's an easy way to orally transmit and to encapsulate a whole philosophical system within a single and very memorizable claim. I mean, taking an example from the Western history, think of Heraclitus' famous claims like, you cannot step into the same river twice, or that war is the father of all things. So, a lot of intriguing issues and questions. So, tonight we will discuss orally about orality, and we won't do it especially along the lines of Western thought, but we rather will focus on African philosophy, where oral traditions have always played a crucial role. And we will also talk more generally about the role of, let's say, non-written traditions in philosophy and their role for reconstructing the history of philosophy. And I'm very happy to now quickly present our three guests for tonight who will discuss the topic with us. That's Anke Graness, Souleymane Bachir Diagne, and Lindokuhle Shabane. So let me start with Anke. Anke Graness studied philosophy and did African studies in Leipzig and Vienna. She led a research project at the University of Vienna, which was on the historiography of philosophy in Africa. That was from 2014 to 19, and then she became the managing director of a Reinhard Koselleck project entitled Histories of Philosophy in Global Perspective. She's currently a visiting professor at the Department of Philosophy in Freiburg im Breisgau, and she's also the vice president of the Society for Intercultural Philosophy. And her research interests include the history of philosophy, philosophy in Africa, intercultural philosophy, global justice, and feminist theory. And amongst her numerous publications, I might just mention one thing, namely a monograph that came out last year with the Surkamp Verlag entitled Philosophie in Afrika, Herausforderungen einer globalen Philosophiegeschichte. And then we have Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who was already mentioned by Ela, and who is currently a WOC International Guest Professor. Bachir received his academic training in philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure and at the Sorbonne in France. He taught philosophy for many years in Senegal, at Dakar, and in the US at Northwestern University, before he then joined Columbia University in 2008. His field of research includes the history of logic, history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy, and literature. And again, I will mention only one monograph of his numerous publications, namely one that appeared in 2018 with Columbia University Press, entitled Open to Reason, Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with Western Tradition. And last but not least, as our, so to speak, local hero, we have Lindokuhle Shabane, who's a doctoral fellow at the research training group Contradiction Studies. And before joining us here in Bremen, he did his undergrad and graduate studies in Durban, South Africa, and his main research interest is in African philosophy and how it might or might not be demarcated from other philosophical traditions. So the concept of contradiction plays an important role in that context, and whether or not orality might play an important part there or not, this is now something he will tell us about. So we will start with 3 short inputs, first by Lindo, then by Anke, then by Bachir. Then we will start the discussion here on the panel, and then after a while open it to the audience here and online. Okay. So far for the introduction. Now we can dive into things, and I hand over to Lindo.
Thank you so much. As Norman has said, my name is Lindokuhle Shabane, and I come from Durban, South Africa, where I studied philosophy. What is interesting for today's discussion about my study of philosophy is that again, I was in South Africa and I studied.
Is the mic on?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. As I was saying, I studied in South Africa and I studied philosophy. But what is interesting, and particularly for what we're talking about today, is that my very first course in philosophy was, so it was called Philosophy 101. We read Socrates, read Plato's Apology, and I suppose the point was, to inject the love of philosophy to the point of death, as is in line with the Apology. And so, throughout my entire undergraduate studies, I studied Western philosophy, so from Germany, from the US, from many parts of the global north, and not many about African philosophy. And nothing was mentioned about orality, despite the fact that, as you already pointed out, that Socrates never written a word. And if anything, Socrates thought that writing sort of messes up with the philosophy, because it then takes away the ability to memorize. But none of that was mentioned because, again, orality was not seen, at least was not presented at the time, as a Western philosophical problem. It was just not mentioned because, okay, Socrates was not written and nobody cared. The problem of orality is something that I encountered when I was doing my master's, where I wanted to write the history of African philosophy. And when I presented the idea to the people at the time and said I wanted to do African philosophy, they said, oh, well, there's this problem. Where are you going to get your sources from? And which tradition are you going to draw from? And particularly the problem is, unlike Western philosophy, African philosophy is not written. And so then who are you going to quote and how are you going to quote them? And there's an inaccessibility to the language. There's so many languages in Africa. Which language are you going to use? There's no lingua franca. And, my attempt to avoid the debate, I said, okay, what I will do is, I will not contend with the problem of orality. I will not contend with the problem of traditionality. What I will do is I will study modern African philosophy. By that I meant, from the 1950s onwards. And there again, there is written work of people started writing in the 50s and the 30s, African philosophers. Then again, when I went into the debate, I was again confronted with the problem of orality, because there it's along the lines of what is African philosophy? Is African philosophy philosophy if it's not written? And so even if people aren't the African philosophers that I was reading at the time, even if they were not explicitly dealing with the problem of orality, they continuously referred back to it. So there's what was called the Great Debate. So the debate was from the 70s to the 90s. That was called the Great Debate because it happened among many countries. famous contenders was Hontonji, the Beninese philosopher Hontonji, and Wiridu, and to some extent Apia, who said, these African traditional things are philosophies, but they're not philosophy proper. And the reason they're not philosophy proper is they're not scientific, they're not critical. And how do they know they're not critical is because, well, they're not written, and so you don't know who the original author is, and it becomes sort of communal folk knowledge. And one of the problems again is that people are not accessible, so they cannot come back to defend their ideas. And thus this proves that African philosophy at that time does not exist. And it should, the very act of writing about African philosophy's existence is the very act of bringing it to life. And so from the get-go, orality then is presented as, at least in this debate, as a problem or a challenge. And any student who wants to study African philosophy has to first deal with this Herculean task of orality. And whatever book you pick from, and I can assure you can do it now, whatever book you pick from in African philosophy, inevitably one way or another presents orality as a problem. And it's also presented as a problem of African philosophy, or rather as an African problem. And so that's what my point of entrance into African philosophy and orality, where it was already presented, and I would argue uncritically presented as a problem. It was presented as a problem of philosophy and a problem of African philosophy. And so I think, when a discourse takes for granted that orality is a problem, and when it takes for granted that it's an African problem, it's already starting a race on a quicksand, because there's whatever interesting ideas you may have, whatever interesting philosophical source you can get from orality is already disabled by the very fact that you think it is a challenge, and you think it is a problem, and you think it is a peculiarly African problem. Now, I must put a caveat and say, some of these philosophers did not explicitly say that this is only an African problem. That is, they were some gesturing towards the fact that many cultures were oral cultures and oral languages were written. But my contention is, I want to attempt to trivialize orality as a problem or as a challenge, to show that, if anything, when we start considering it a challenge, we are pulling ourselves away from the interesting, and we're distracting ourselves away from an interesting conversation. And I want to show that the gap between orality and textuality is less than one would assume, and if anything, it might be more illusionary than we think. And we can consider actually someone who's in the panel, Bachir, whose work is on what he calls intertextuality. So the idea that oral traditions have always been in conversation with textual traditions, and when one starts to engage with the text, one does this in an oral way, and orality and textuality are always interwoven. Another person who's also thought about this is Kwasi Wiredu. Kwasi Wiredu is a Ghanaian philosopher who wrote that textuality is not very independent from orality. If anything, speech habits always bleed onto, and they always influence written habits. And he was doing that he was doing it for his project of conceptual decolonization. But what essentially says is that when oral traditions are transcribed into written word, characteristics of the spoken language, the rhythm, the tone, and the contextual, and the grammatical and the syntactical structures of spoken language influence how thoughts are organized and articulated in the text, so in writing. And one also sees the gap in Derrida, where Derrida's work is to problematize these very rigid differences between orality and writing, and he deconstructs the borders between the two, where he places both textuality and orality, and he subjects them to interpretation and difference. So it's in different context. He says that there's iterability, and that both written and spoken signs can be repeated in different contexts, acquiring new meanings each time. And so this shows that many philosophers have thought about orality and textuality, but they've always also shown that those two things start and they're always intertwined, and it's not very easy to disentangle them, and the gap to think that orality and textuality are independent, such that there are cultures that are totally oral or cultures that are totally textual, is illusionary. That they're actually intertwined in very interesting ways. Which then brings me to my second last point, the old problem of African philosophy that I started with, where I said, notice that when we were speaking of Western philosophy and problems of morality, they were not assumed and understood as problems of...
Closer. We don't.
Okay, sorry. I was...
Yeah, you have to hold it closer.
Yeah, I mistakenly looked at the people I was talking to and forgot that they're actually people in the crowd. Thank you, Sabine. So then this, if we then start to revisit the old debate on can philosophy exist in oral cultures, after having shown that these two are intertwined and having tried to trivialize this debate, again we go back to Orality and it becomes instructive, and we see that, and we make something very interesting that I would like to share with you. He talks about drums, and he talks about drums as text. Again, going back to Derrida, what is considered as a text. He talks that in a can, people play drums, and these drums have patterns that people recognize, and these patterns speak something. And one of the patterns that he wants to focus on, he says these patterns were about drumming and asking about the existence of God. So if you know the language, or you have to let the language, you learn the pattern, but if you know the language, you understand that these people are talking about the existence of God, and they're asking, does God exist? If he exists, who told him to make the world? And so he says to some people, when they look at these things, they want to put mysticism and he says, that is sign A, that African cultures, oral or otherwise, were not monolithic, and so the challenge of asking whether African philosophy can come out of an oral culture becomes trivial, because these cultures have always been critical, they've always had counter examples, they've always had any proverb that comes up as a counter proverb and says this pattern of drumming, for example, is an atheist questioning a very popular idea of God among the Arkan. Okay, and now my very last point, because I no longer have time. I just want to again stick to one last problem of preservation, because that's one of the things that people, again, tend to show that textuality and orality are not so separated, and that the idea of phrasing it as a problem distracts us from very important questions we could ask of orality. There's a problem of preservation, which is one of the very many points when people speak about orality, especially in the context of African philosophy, which is to say that, it is a famous saying, I think also Bachir has also quoted it, which is that the death of an elder is the burning of a library, and that, or rather, and also that there's this kind of lost urgency that we need to attend to when we are dealing with orality, because these people are dying and these people are going, and there's not interest in transmission, there's no way of preserving these knowledges. What this takes, and what this forgets, is that orality has ways and has invented techniques of remembering and keeping those things, as you made an example with proverbs and aphorisms. These things had always been transmitted to people through songs, through patterns, and through. So the idea of the urgency of preserving through written is not so important if you realize that the people were presenting things and they were preserving knowledge. And the other thing, that because there are no elders, as Hontojo said, there are no elders, and there are no people who we know who made these proverbs, that means we cannot hold them to account, we cannot call them. Forgets a very important point, which points back to Derrida and others, that in any case, even if it's written, even if it was oral, anything that is put forward has always been reinterpreted by people. So a proverb can start off meaning one thing in one generation, and then to the next generation it would mean something else depending on the context of the time. And marginalized that we are only now rediscovering. So either, in any case, it's a problem of colonial erasure, that there are many elders dying and the knowledge is dying with them, rather than the fact that they were not making any effort to find ways of preserving the knowledge. And that, I will end on that note for now. Hopefully I have trivialized the idea of viewing orality, especially in Africa, as a problem or as a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we move on to Anke.
Yeah, thank you very much for your input already, which gives me the chance to link to some of the ideas which you mentioned here already. I would like to use the chance of my small input today to highlight 3 points. Namely, if we talk today about orality in philosophy, I would like to hint on the contributions on this topic by feminist theory. Then I would like to focus a little bit on practices of philosophizing, as you did partially now already. I would like to dive a bit deeper into it, and I would like to raise the issue of authorship. All this, of course, very, very short here as a small input. And I will not so much focus on African philosophies, even though this is one of my research focus, because, I mean, here are 2 brilliant scholars from the continent, and so far I would also like to draw on different perspectives here, not only on African philosophies. Lindo, if you said that you were confronted in your studies still with the problem of being faced with prejudice against oral philosophies and posing it as a problem for philosophy, I have the impression that since some years now, a reflection on the status of oral philosophical traditions in the discipline of philosophy is gaining more importance. And various scholars are working on this issue now, not only from the African continent. In particular, our discipline, philosophy, can no longer ignore non-European philosophers, but as well post- and decolonial theorists calling for the equal treatment of previously marginalized and suppressed knowledge traditions. So a liberation of the oral traditions of formerly colonially oppressed peoples from their marginalized position in the scientific system is one of the central concerns of decolonial theory. The representatives demand that orality be recognized as a quality in its own right and not devalued as a deficiency. So I mean, there are arguments from different sides, from different disciplines also going into this direction and demanding that orality is recognized as in its own importance. It is argued that the integration of orally transmitted philosophical traditions is indispensable and an essential aspect of decolonization. But perhaps even earlier than these interventions by decolonial theorists or also by so many African philosophers and philosophers from other traditions, there were interventions of feminist theory and feminist historiography of philosophy, which called for other media of expression and practices of philosophizing besides writing to be recognized and respected, since women's philosophical knowledge was and often is, until today, expressed in media other than academic treatises due to their centuries-long exclusion from established educational systems, particularly from the exclusion of institutions of higher education and because of the exclusion from academic discourses. So feminist historiography argues since a while already that the search for women philosophers must become more open and include other genres and practices of transmission of thought and concepts than the conventional male-centered historiography of philosophy, which is concentrating on written texts. One of the basic demands of a feminist historiography of philosophy is finding new source materials. You also said, one argument is is the source materials. This is the same question if you search for the contribution of women philosophers in the history of philosophy in all but also a broader range of modes of expression and philosophical practices. Examples are practices such as asceticism, meditation, artwork, or storytelling. So here's a research in the reconstruction of marginalized knowledge traditions in other regions of the world, other than Europe or North America, and feminist historiography actually intersect. Unfortunately, this intersection of interest and research issues is not yet recognized so broadly. So this is the first point which I wanted to make, that there's also a contribution, or there are reflections about how to deal with oral traditions from the feminist theory. Let me turn now to practices of philosophizing. So in recent decades, research and reconstruction of philosophical traditions in oral knowledge systems has intensified. So we find various studies on the philosophical concepts and traditions of First Nation peoples in North America, in Central and South America, in Australia, and in New Zealand. So as you rightly pointed out already, it's not just an African problem, and there's a lot of work also done in other regions of the world. My impression now, and both of you can of course correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression what concerns the discourse in Africa is that research on philosophical traditions in context with predominantly oral knowledge transmission has focused in African philosophy primarily on linguistic expressions of philosophy. Despite serious methodological differences in reconstructing philosophical concepts in oral contexts, the majority of the approaches share a focus on philosophy as expressed in propositions. This is also the case in the debate which you mentioned between the 1970s and 1990s. What is remarkable about current debates in African philosophy on the status of oral philosophical traditions is that they are conducted with a narrow focus on the possibility of transmitting philosophical concepts, ideas, or theories in the form of linguistic expression. Other forms of expression, such as rituals or bodily practices like meditation, dance, or art, are just as little in the focus of the investigations as religious artifacts or pictures, sculptures, music, and other forms of expression. Such forms of expressing philosophy receive far more attention in discourse on philosophical traditions in Asia, New Zealand, Australia, or the First Nation peoples in the Americas. For example, studies of Maori philosophy in New Zealand and philosophies of First Nation peoples often emphasize a practice orientation of philosophy by including discussion about dance, tattoos, rituals, and the like. An example is J. Welsh's book, The Phenomenology of a Performative Knowledge System, Dancing with Native American Epistemology, published in 2019. And J. Welsh is of the origin of the First Nation people in the Americas, and she is a young philosopher in the US. She investigates how dance choreography and performance exemplify both truth and meaning-making in indigenous American epistemologies. Welsh shows that in communities of First Nation peoples in America, dance is regarded both as an integral cultural practice and an expression of wisdom. She argues that dance is a form of embodied narrative storytelling, and considers dance and dancing a means to create and communicate knowledge of beliefs and histories. In indigenous American philosophy, Welsh argues, the definition of truth is purely procedural and action-centered, as opposed to propositional. Truth is, and I quote, constituted by the performance of an action rather than by content or nature of statements. In consequence, she describes indigenous American epistemologies as a performative knowledge system. And what she also documents in her book is that under the colonial rule or under colonialism in North America, First Nation people were in purpose forbidden to dance, to do the practice of their dancing, because the colonizers knew about the importance of dancing for transmitting knowledge in these, for these peoples. Another Native American philosopher, Marilyn Lota Verney, argues similarly with reference to indigenous traditions in North America, and I quote, I want to give you a bit longer quote of her book. She says, "As indigenous people, we do have something to contribute to traditional academic philosophy. Our philosophy is told through stories, songs, ceremonial dances, art, and our ways of being in the world. Our philosophy is an oral philosophy. It is through oral philosophical method that the sacredness of traditional beliefs, songs, dances, and stories embodies our ontologies, epistemologies, metaphysics, ethics, and science of being in the world. So long as we retain philosophical meaning and connection with all our relations, with who we are as American Indians, our philosophy is of being in the world. Our philosophy of being in the world will remain intact. Once ideas are written down in black and white, those ideas become objects, something to be studied and taken away. This process of writing separates our being in the world, and we can lose touch and become isolated from our relations." I think this is a very interesting quote, because what she tries to show here is also the danger of writing something down. Yeah? They lose, she pronounces, relation to their being in the world. Insofar, I would also maybe like to discuss the question today here, is the contradiction, if it is a contradiction, you also already pointed out maybe it is not a contradiction, or is the relation between textuality and orality, is this really the main problem? Or should we not rather think more general about what does it mean to philosophize? What is our practice of philosophizing? How do we philosophize? And finally, what is philosophy? Okay, here we have a lot of food maybe to think already. Nevertheless, I would like to raise a third problem, which is also important to me and my work as my work, as a historian of philosophy. And actually, at the moment, we are conceptualizing a series on history of philosophy in Africa or of Africa for the big the important series on historiography of philosophy in German language, namely the Überweg, Grundriss der Geschichte der Philosophie. We are planning a series on African philosophy, or philosophies of Africa will be the title. And here's a question also, many questions, methodological questions, we have to answer by conceptualizing such a book series. But one of the questions is, of course, the importance of authorship. Is authorship important for philosophy and for writing a history of philosophy? Is it indeed a crucial criterion for philosophy, or can a philosophical tradition or a concept go unattributed into the history of philosophy? And this is, of course, the main problem concerning oral traditions. In attempts to reconstruct philosophy and oral traditions, philosophy is often understood as a kind of shared knowledge, as a communal system of thought, of which perhaps not everyone in the community is aware of, but which is anchored in language and oral traditions, as well as in religious practices of conflict resolution, and ways of dealing with nature, etc. So Karl Mika, for example, brings it to the point in one of his articles on Maori philosophy. He himself is from the Maori nation. He says, "For Maori, philosophy always simply manifests as a current concern, and we do not have to refer back to any individual writer." And he even brings it more sharply to a point in saying, "Any idea is not my own. Any idea is not my own." Here Mika brings to the fore encounter in many texts on indigenous philosophies in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and also in the discussions in Africa, for example, the school of ethnophilosophy, right, is also not focusing on individual thinkers. Namely, that the origin of philosophical ideas lie in the community, and that an individual's thinking is not the final mediator of an idea. Such an approach points to the inextricable integration of every philosopher in the respective historical, social, political, linguistic, and religious context in which their ideas arise. This view emphasizes the socialization conditions of the production of ideas and concepts, and that in our thinking we all stand both on the shoulders of our ancestors and in debt to our fellow human beings, without whom we could not produce our ideas and concepts. In this respect, such an approach calls us to be humble about our own intellectual achievements, as well as to a somewhat more realistic assessment of the intellectual achievements of historical persons who are considered giants in the historiography of various disciplines. Their often uncounted collaborators and colleagues remain unmentioned, as do the contributions of, for example, women as mothers, wives, muses, or assistants. So there are some advantages, not to focus on authorship anymore. But I see also disadvantages. And one main disadvantage is, of course, that giving up the question of authorship leads to philosophy becoming an unhistorical matter, detached not only from the minds of concrete people, but also from the context of origin. And then we are confronted with kind of perennial concepts also. And I think to give up the idea of history, or the historical development of concepts and theories is not a good idea, I think. And of course, from the feminist perspective, another problem becomes evident because both concepts like Bantu philosophy or Maori philosophy are supposed to be gender neutral, in the sense that women's thinking and philosophy becomes invisible in these approaches as well. The documentation of women's contribution to philosophy and its history can only succeed if authorship remains an important criterion. So, insofar we are here faced with a lot of questions and problems in reconstructing oral philosophies, and I just asked the questions and forward to you.
Thank you very much. I'll add my own problems as well as questions. Well, first of all, orality, the question of orality in philosophy puts emphasis on what we might call African indigenous languages. That is one first point to be made. We talk about Anglophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and more and more people are putting some emphasis on non-Europhone Africa, meaning Africa that doesn't speak or write European languages. And this is a negative way of putting it. There are a positive way that I find also sometimes from time to time, which would be Afrophone Africa. That being said, I am among the people who would say that French, English, Portuguese are now languages of Africa. If you want to make a difference, we'll talk about languages of Africa and versus African languages to make the difference between the two. But basically, if you look at the literature in African philosophy, it is a literature that has been developed in heteroglossia or diglossia, because people would think between languages or from language to language, and that is the reason why when you talk about African philosophy now, you have to deal with very precise concepts that you analyze, Ubuntu being one of those, coming from your country. Ujamaa as African socialism is one of those. Nite as what it means to be human in Senegal, in Wolof, is one of those. In other words, when you talk about African philosophy, you could just go through a glossary, now of concepts that have been constructed from African languages to serve certain purposes, the purpose of helping formulate problems that arise and deal with those problems. That is what philosophy does. I mean, there are many definitions. I adopt Deleuze and Guattari's definition that philosophy is construction of concept to address problems as they are arising, formulate them, and deal with them. And this has been happening in African philosophy in concepts that have been constructed by African philosophers. It could be construction in English, in French, in Portuguese. It could be also using the concepts originally in African languages. So this is practice of philosophy, as you mentioned it. So that being said, we can be more relaxed about what African philosophy is. It is being produced. Now you have shelves and shelves of books written by African philosophers, so it is maybe time to put less emphasis about the eternal meta-philosophical question of what it exists. That's one aspect. Second aspect now, if we look at non-European African philosophy, what does it mean? On the one hand, orature, as it has been called, sometimes orality or orature, and I think that the word was maybe coined by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I may be mistaken, but orature is now used sometimes. But it is also non-European philosophy is also written philosophy. In other words, you have a tradition of written erudition also in Africa, and this is important to emphasize. After all, Tertullian is an African philosopher. After all, Saint Augustine is an African philosopher. Otherwise, how do you define Africa? What is Africa? If you take Islamic Africa, the Sudan as it was called, West Africa in general, northern part of West Africa, or the Swahili word, those are the same name. People do not realize that Sahel and Swahili are actually the same Arabic root, meaning shore. So in one case, the Sahel is the shore of the Sahara compared to an ocean, and on the other side, the Swahili word is the shore of the Indian Ocean. Those are huge regions of Africa where Islam developed, and the development of Islam was not just the adoption of a religion, it was also the adoption of a tradition of philosophical thinking. Those are regions where, for example, in Timbuktu, Aristotle's logic was studied and discussed. Written in Arabic, which is an African language, as you know, and also discussed and commented in indigenous languages. So this is an important aspect of what this tradition of written erudition is. I've been dealing with that. This is an aspect of my work. This is the third chapter of my book on African philosophy, titled The Ink of the Scholars, that Lindo has been mentioning and discussing. And also the collective book, the book I edited with my colleague from South Africa, Shamin Jeffrey, The Meanings of Timbuktu. Timbuktu being one of those places where you have this tradition of written erudition. Timbuktu, which was the intellectual capital, not the political capital, but the intellectual capital of the Empire of Mali first, and then the Songhai Empire. Why is it important to insist on these? Because that is how you understand fully the intellectual history of Africa. You have to take that into account and consider that the Sahara is not a wall separating two worlds. Because unconsciously, we have that in mind, that the northern part of the Sahara is a different world than the southern part of the Sahara. But if you want to understand fully the intellectual history of this continent, we have to take that into account. So, as I always say, and I had the pleasure of discussing that with the fellows of work, Africa is not married with orality. Orality orality is just one aspect of African cultures, and this is an important thing. Now, if we concentrate, if I focus on orality, obviously we have this famous saying by my good friend and my former mentor, Paul Tonji, who died recently, as you know. His famous declaration, I call African philosophy the set of texts written by Africans and qualified as philosophy by their authors themselves. After that, he tried to come back to that and sort of mitigate and revisit his declaration. But that meant, in a way, that he was dismissive of orature and philosophy. And he accepted that his declaration was maybe too sharp, as anything that you kind of work for it to be a formula that everybody is going to remember. Usually when you do that, you betray yourself also somewhere. And he did think that way afterwards. But we do not need to dismiss that on the basis that orature or orality doesn't allow for critical thinking, that oral texts never revisit themselves. In other words, you cannot have the critical distance necessary to look at an oral text. But one of the points I was making, and Lindo came back to that, is if you study orature, you can see certain texts being parody or some form of re-evaluation of texts that had been already in circulation. I don't insist on that, Lindo did it very well. I will just focus now on one text that came from orality, which is the famous book by French ethnologist Marcel Griol, Conversations with Okotomeli. The original title in French was Dieu d'eau, and Dieu d'eau was published in 1948. Marcel Griol, for those who are not anthropologists or who are not familiar with that author, was a famous French anthropologist who, in the beginning of the 20th century, was a student. He was a student of Marcel Mauss, and then he worked in Africa, he worked in Ethiopia, and then he was part of that famous Dakar-Djibouti mission that crossed the country, the continent from Djibouti to Dakar and went to and he was a specialist in particular of the Dogon region. And what happened is that Marcel Griol used to go there and do some research, ethnological research, and he mentioned that one day during one of his latest expedition, when he came back, there was this Dogon sage who just summoned him, sent someone to say, okay, go seek the white man who has been coming and asking questions here and bring him to me. And when he came, he said that during 33 days, he had conversations with Okotomeli, and Okotomeli was explaining to him the cosmology of the Dogon people, many aspects of what the Dogon people were doing. So, for example, explaining what sacrifice meant, the ritual of sacrifice, someone who is in charge of making sacrifices, what is it exactly that he is doing? And one kind of explanation that Griol got from Okotomeli was to say, okay, the person who is performing the sacrifice actually is taking from the animal that has been slaughtered, a ram, the life force that he is going to redistribute in the community, and in so doing he will be increasing the life force of the community. In other words, that sacrifice itself was a kind of synecdoche, a kind of microcosm of the general cosmology of the Dogon, which is the cosmology of life force, a dynamic ontology, coming from the creation of the world by the god Amma, who first created Nomo, and Nomo was a twin character, having 8 limbs, because basically he was a twin personality. Interestingly, not just the Dogon, but before the Dogon, the people whom basically the Dogon inherited from, the Telem people, their art is very much an art of gemelity. You find very often sculptures, very filiform type of sculptures, because they would be raising their hands, and they look very much like Giacometti sculpture, for example. And they come as twin. So these are representative, they say something about the cosmology of gemelity in the Dogon people, because the first people were twin, they were created as double, and then the god decided that there would be individual people, but even when they were individuals, they would be still carrying their twin within them. So this idea that the human being is born androgynous, and that would explain, by the way, why at initiation you would have a circumcision both for boys and girls, because what the circumcision would be doing is take out from the boy his female side and do the same thing with the girl. Obviously, it's not the same operation, obviously, because a piece of skin is not the same as an organ. But that is the metaphysical explanation of that. I'm just giving these 2 examples, the sacrifice and these, to say something about what it means for the sage to have summoned the ethnologist and say, okay, you are not the one asking questions, because basically you do not know what questions you have to ask. In other words, you come with being the subject who knows, and then you ask the questions while you are interested in having informants, and then you put in form what your informant gives you. But actually you have no clue, not just because of your way of putting that in form, but you have no clue even of what you should be asking. This is important because when Griol finished his text, he published it in 1948. That expedition he had with the Dogon people was in 1946. He discovered then that a few months before, this philosopher, this Belgian philosopher Placide Tempels, had published a book that was very famous, became very famous, Bantu philosophy. And he said, oh, it is amazing that what Tempels found among the Bantu people resonates very much with what I have found with the Dogon people and what Ogotomeli taught me. Yes, in that sense, you could make a comparison between the two. But there was a huge difference between the two, and this brings me back to orality. The difference was that Tempels wrote that he was the one capable of exhuming, so to say, putting in light the ontological principles of the Bantu people. Do not expect, he says, those Bantu people to be able to explain to you their own ontological principles. But those ontological principles are here, and they are the underlying sphere of everything that has been described by the ethnologists and the anthropologists. They never went deep enough to see how the whole rituals, the whole institutions, the language even, everything is really founded upon a set of ontological principles, and the main ontological principle is being is force. To be is to be a force. So the fundamental principle for that was Ntu and Tu, being force, and which is actually the radical itself, or Ubuntu, comes. But again, he was the only one equipped, intellectually equipped with the tools and the categories to come up with Bantu philosophy. The difference was radical with Griol. In the case of Griol, it is Ogotomeli who called him and said, come, I'm going to explain to you what our cosmology is, how it explains what we do, and what it tells about how we understand what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a person. In other words, to become from being just an individual to become fully a person, a fully achieved human being with the support of the community. Again, one of the stereotypes is that African cultures are about the collective and the West is individualistic, etc. One has to understand more precisely what it means to move from being an individual to becoming a person with the support of the community. This has nothing to do with being just an individual and saying that the collective is everything. The individual doesn't count, and the collective has all rights, and the individual only has duties vis-a-vis the community. So all of these are actually being explained and taught by Ogotomeli orally, from orature. In the case of temples, he may have come up with things similar to what Ogotomeli was saying, but he was the one who decided that he was the philosopher, and all he asked the Bantu people were to speak and behave, and he would interpret what it is that they were doing. That is a very important aspect of orature. And in continuity with that, with the sage, with Ogotomeli as the sage African philosopher who has himself created this distance vis-a-vis the ritual of his community in order to come up with an explanation at a higher level than just a level of description. And this is philosophizing, explaining to his interlocutor what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human, what it means to be God, what religion means, etc. All these fundamental questions, why is there something rather than nothing, and why this rather than something different, which are the two questions fundamental in philosophy according to Leibniz. One last point about proverbs and the use of proverbs. A proverb by itself is not philosophical. It would be absurd for someone to say, okay, I'm explaining to you African philosophy, world of philosophy, come up with a set of proverbs and say this is the philosophical meaning of those proverbs. It is absurd because you would come up with proverbs that say something and it's contrary. You always have a proverb that says A and a proverb that says non-A. So this kind of folk wisdom is useless unless, and this brings me back to my definition of what philosophy is, construction of concept, unless you construct these proverbs philosophically in order, again, to formulate a problem and to deal with it. This is what Senghor did. When he mentioned this Wolof proverb, nit nitei garaba, meaning a human is the remedy for another human, which basically looks like very much like Ubuntu as well. Humanity is not a state, it is a responsibility. You move towards your own humanity. Actually, when he talks about remedy, the illness is the illness of having not yet achieved fully what it means to be human. The human being is a destination. We have to become who we should be. The toti and einai that Aristotle mentioned about the goal of the human being to become who you have to be is also a component of Ubuntu or Nite in this case. And the reason why Senghor reconstructed that proverb is that he needed to think the notion of a universality of human rights, which was the real problem. People were discussing at that time whether or not Africa should have a charter of human rights and what it means to have human rights corresponding to African philosophy. So simplistic way was to say, oh my goodness, let's put emphasis on the group. rather than the individual because our philosophy is more about the group. Well, if you do not have the individual as bearer of rights, you cannot have cultural change. You cannot fight the practice, for example, of female circumcision that I mentioned, etc. You have to make the individual a bearer of the individual rights. And that reworking, the philosophical reworking by Senghor of that proverb served that purpose. And that is where something which is banal as the proverb becomes philosophical, because you have constructed it as such. And that should be our relationship to orality. And by the way, Hegel uses a very famous German proverb. In the Phenomenology of the Spirit, at one point he says, as the proverb says, one cannot be a hero for their valet. Okay? Meaning, okay, if my valet sees me going here and there, going to the toilets, he would not take me seriously as being the Emperor Napoleon. But the way in which Hegel was using that was to say precisely a hero or a great man. I mean, he only had man in his mind, so let's keep the gender language here. The great man is just another human being with his passions and his ambition, and this was the case for Bonaparte. But he was in a way selected by the absolute spirit, as Hegel presented it or called it, to become the one who was going to bring actually Europe at the level of what the absolute spirit demanded at that time. So in a way, the absolute idea or the absolute spirit inhabited Napoleon, turning him into the great man who changed the face of Europe in his wars. So that is the meaning he gave to this proverb. He reconstructed it philosophically. Before that, it was just a proverb, and I'm sure that you have in German proverb that would say the contrary of that. I mean, my mother knew me very well, but she thought that I was the most important person on earth. So that would be another way of putting that. So yeah, these two things, the case of Obotomeli versus temples, and the case of the use of proverbs, is why I'm insisting on that simple definition of philosophy, or the practice of philosophy, as the construction of concepts. Now you construct it from local languages, indigenous languages, or so-called European languages. Since they have become now languages of Africa, it's just a matter of being able to think between languages in diglossia or heteroglossia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all three for your inputs. I think in terms of the time we already have, I think we can just mix questions here on the panel, and if people online would like to ask something, it doesn't work with the audio, but you can write something on the chat. So you can't do it orally; you have to do it in written form. Yeah, but maybe consider your question. Maybe I start with one thing that came to my mind, especially Anke, when you gave your input, and then maybe relating back also to the other inputs. So I found it very important to the emphasis on the practices, and then also what happens in the transmission from the oral to the written. And then there was this quote saying, well, if we get it into the written form, it's kind of an object then. I mean, that wasn't the exact word, but it seems like it's somehow kind of petrifying things, or you then you get the printed image of something, and now hijacking it to a topic I'm very much interested in, namely hearing. I mean, it seems to me that, orality, it has to do with what you hear, whereas often the written text is with what you see. And it seems to me, since you were also all talking about marginalization and what we don't take into account, from my perspective, and I would wonder whether you agree with that, or whether you can link it especially to the African context, but it seems to me that there is a huge neglect in the history, especially of Western philosophy, of hearing, right? We have all these, I mean, there are insight, it's the light of truth, I mean, it's enlightenment, Aufklärung, it's all visual, and that all seems to me to be kind of very static, like, yeah, it's there, in black and white, whereas the orality, the hearing always has the transient, the dynamic to it, and it seems to so I would additionally on the list with the African context and the feminist context, I would, so to speak, put also a sense modality context there and say, well, but we also shouldn't neglect the hearing. And I was just wondering whether that makes sense to you or whether that sounds weird. I mean, you had the examples with the, especially also with the drumming. Who wants to?
I agree.
Yeah, I agree too. I mean, because that would be rhythm is something important, and it reminds me of something that Sieroka says about rhythm, analyzing rhythm. This idea that the word is to exist is to be a force. What individualizes a force is its rhythm. I mean, if we are all force, how do you distinguish us? What is the principle of individuation? Each of us is a particular rhythm. So this is what it means to be really listening to the word instead of just looking at it. Because looking at it is looking at it from distance. And listening to it is being one with it. It is a form of knowledge of the word as movement, as rhythm, as music. And this is something that African art tries to capture as well. I mean, the philosophy of African art as thought of by Senghor is to say that the reason why it is never an imitation of nature. You do not respect the proportion. You do not respect the fact that the head should be 1/8 of the total, and so on and so forth, because you want to play with that. You want to play with the rhythm, actually, the plastic rhythm of it. And in that sense, you are really dealing with another form of relationship to reality. You are not petrifying reality in an analytical way when you separate yourself from it and you separate the object into its components in order to know it. You become one with it. Everything that philosophy traditionally calls intuition as opposed to analytical reasoning as well. So hearing is very important here. Or the sculpture, African mask as embodiment, actually, of a philosophy. To come back to what Anke was saying about the fact that the expression orality is not just what is being said, it is also what is being represented in a mask or in something different.
Yeah, just to add a few thoughts about it. Of course, basically, I absolutely agree with you. I think also that hearing or listening is actually an art, which we lost to a certain degree in our very much visually oriented context or culture here, at least in Europe. Interestingly, hearing is a basic concept in ancient Egyptian manuscripts. It is widely used in ancient Egyptian manuscripts. It has a very important function in the Mad concept, the basic concept of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And I think rethinking the concept of listening or hearing, one can really draw fruitfully also on the ancient Egyptian sage, or as I call it, philosophical tradition. Yeah, this is what I would like to add to your comment. But actually, I would like to use the chance to put your definition of philosophy into question. Because you said for you, philosophy is about the construction of concepts, right? Well, I'm not quite sure, because shouldn't we go beyond this idea, which is also based on propositions, on language concepts? Shouldn't we go beyond this? Because, I mean, and you even in explaining what you wanted to say with this definition of philosophy, you have been drawing very much contribute to the betterment of humanity, right? To the betterment of the individual or the whole humanity. And in so far, I wonder if not practices like asceticism or like meditation are philosophical practices, but meditation, for example, attempts to go beyond all terms, categories, or concepts, yeah, to reach a certain status of nothingness. And in so far, I don't know if you focus on the construction of concepts, if this is not a too narrow definition of philosophy. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Actually, my work in Islamic philosophy is about the way in which there was a translation of Greek philosophy and psychology in Greek philosophy, the Diagne, the study of the faculties of the human being, translation with the Quranic anthropology, with Quranic anthropology. And you find this notion that among the faculties of the human being, you have the highest faculty, which could be called the prophetic faculty or the heart of a third eye. It doesn't matter what you compare it to. But the point is that our connection with that prophetic faculty is what gives us a kind of immediate relationship to reality, which is something we reach through meditation. The problem comes if you have the responsibility of talking afterwards to human beings. You have to translate, you have to enunciate, and this is where you have to create and construct concepts. An example given by Avicenna, for example, is to say, well, the responsibility of the prophet is to talk to people. He has grasped these intelligible ideas without a single word, and that is what you do when you open up your prophetic faculty to things. Now, how do you do if you have to speak to lay people like myself? You have this first translation of your imagination, the faculty of imagination, meaning that what you have grasped, which is absolutely formless, maybe even without directionless. You lose yourself in that reality, you become one with it, and if you are one with it, north, south, east, west do not make sense, directions do not make sense. But if you need to speak, to go to the state of enunciation and enter the public square, then you have to speak and you have to construct concepts. That is the point of the construction of concepts. No, not about what you experience, but what you formulate. Because if you are dealing with a problem, that problem is something you have to formulate in order to deal with it, because it always involves your relationship to the world. If you were just contemplating, that would not be a problem. So we do agree. It is simply that we are speaking animals, and the contradiction we are in, and Taylor likes it when we talk about contradiction. The contradiction that we are in that situation is you have to use the language, and the language is the creation of our analytical faculty. You have to use the language of the analytical faculty to speak about something that has a connection with our intuitive faculty. So you can't do it. So how do you do it? You use the analytical language, but you try to go beyond language within language. You use language in a way that will take you out of language in order to try to formulate what it is that you are trying to say. And you multiply metaphors. That's what you do in that case. And in this case, even poetic metaphors that you are multiplying in order to make something that doesn't belong to the language understood, is still a construction of concept. The concept of duration, for example, in Bergson, there is no single definition. He can't define it. Duration is really something that you intuit. You do not deduct it. You do not have an analytical relationship to it. So the only way you can talk about it is to multiply metaphors in language. And one of the metaphors he uses is to snowball with oneself. I mean, it is beautiful. When I read that, I understood what he meant, but I would be incapable of explaining what it is. But I think I grasped it. So it is a difference between grasping in meditation and enunciating when you are dealing with fellow human beings. That was a very long answer to you, something short. I'm sorry about that.
No, it was a very good answer.
You have a question? Yeah.
I just have two quick questions, for one for each.
Louder. Sorry.
I just have two.
No, I mean.
No, I understand.
Yeah, when you turn towards
Yeah,
us,
how about that?
Just put it closer to you.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah. I have just two questions. Is it? Yeah. Two questions. One is so Anke, you spoke about the question of authorship, and this is, I think, a direct quote. Authorship is important for philosophy. And one of the reasons, and I think either you said it today, or I've read somewhere else that you said it, where you say when we lose this concept of authorship, when people are being mentioned as authors, two things happen. One is that certain groups of people whose work, like women, are being marginalized and forgotten, and the other thing is that philosophy devolves to thinking, and it also becomes historical. So my question then is, then you gave a definition of what you understand as philosophy, and then you included practice, you included meditation, and it doesn't seem clear to me then that there is authorship still stands in those kind of definitions, and so it seems to be in contradiction to each other, that authorship is important for philosophy, and then other men and then speak of other ways of doing philosophy, which are right, the marks, the meditation and acts and practices, and those do not have authorship, and I wonder if those are not contradictory. And one question I have is on the Bachir's construction of proverbs. As we folk with Souleymane, also it's a kind of a banal statement that does not have propositional value on it. I would think that the very fact of being able to take something out of it philosophical is because it's been constructed in a way that is conducive for philosophical thinking, if not itself philosophical. Because, I say this because there are many statements that are used in many cultures that are not proverbs, that are just statements or sayings, that we distinguish between sayings and proverbs precisely because proverbs have something of a philosophical value already inherently injected in them. And I was wondering, if you say proverbs themselves are not are banal, how do you then distinguish them from sayings? Because they seem to be differently injected with philosophical things. And also then that would mean that any statement that is said seems banal until someone constructed a philosophical thing out of it.
Yeah.
That was just two questions.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, which is crucial, of course. I wouldn't call it a contradiction. I wanted to pose a problem, or describe a methodological challenge. So on the one hand, I think there are convincing arguments to open the philosophy, and particularly the historiography of philosophy, for a broader spectrum of practices and genres for the reconstruction of the history of philosophy. And also in our doing today, we have to reflect what are we doing when we are philosophizing, and I think also in our about a text which I've been reading before. And I think not. Yeah, and also this discussion which we are doing at the moment here is a part of doing oral philosophy, actually, and we are doing such things a lot, actually, also in our academic practice. It's often forgotten, yeah, that a big part of our academic practice is oral practice. I think there are convincing arguments to be open for different modes of expression and practices. I think all of us here on the podium, at least, we agree that oral traditions, that there's philosophy in oral traditions, and that it is worth reconstructing them and drawing to them. So this is an agreement, but from the perspective of writing, being a practitioner of writing a history of philosophy, for me, the unsolved question is how to deal with the problem of authorship. Yeah, because I mean, our histories of philosophy, as they are written mainly, I mean, there are different forms too, but the dominant form of writing a history of philosophy is drawing on persons and describing concepts in their centuries or in their regions, and how concepts traveled during the regions and centuries. How shall we reconstruct oral philosophies in the framework of writing a history of philosophy? Let us draw to the concept which is very familiar to you, Ubuntu. In which century shall I settle Ubuntu? Yeah, if I write a history of philosophy. And who are the authors? Who were the first ones using this concept? This is so difficult. And we have to discuss, is this important or not? Yeah. And I think it is not unimportant, because I have problem with such ideas of perennial concepts, as if they have been always there. I think concepts always emerge in a certain context, and they have a certain function in this context. But this is what we cannot show up, yeah, if we give up the idea of authorship, or at least, I don't know how, I mean, this, yeah, you know, this is really my practical question, how to deal with it. And the second point is, of course, how to reconstruct the contributions of women to thinking, yeah, to philosophical thinking. Yeah. So it's a question.
Okay.
Thank you. Actually, my answer to your question would be exactly what Anke just said. A word is banal before it becomes a concept. The word Ubuntu is banal before it became the concept that it has become when used as such by Mandela and Desmond Tutu. In other words, the proverb, the famous proverb that defines it, Ubuntu, Ubuntu,
Yes.
Gabon, that is being repeated, would not call any attention before it was constructed as a concept. To give you an example, Rwandan philosopher Alexis Kagame, who studied the Kenya-Rwandan language and had this approach to philosophy, African philosophy, precisely through languages. He looks at many different Bantu languages, compares them, and he explains in his Philosophie Bantu Rwandaise de l'être, unfortunately it is only in French, he has not been translated. He explains that U is a way in the way in which in Bantu, in the Kenya-Rwandan language and other Bantu languages, you go from the concrete to the abstract. So Ubuntu or Bantu being the plural of Muntu, human beings, Ubuntu becomes humanity. You go from humans to humanity. And he gives that example without saying anything about Ubuntu. There was no reason for him to consider that Ubuntu was important. The only thing he says when he looks at that as an example of grammar is to say, well, in this case, we do not use Ubuntu to mean humanity in the sense of the set of human beings, but we have another expression for humanity, and we specialize Ubuntu in the sense of liberality, munificence, being generous, for example. And this is something that Mandela said. When he was interviewed about the meaning of Ubuntu, he says Ubuntu means many different things, but in the end, it just means making the community better. This was a definition by Mandela. Now, when it became a concept is when it was used to tackle the problem of what it means to get out of the logic of tribes to enter the logic of humanity, to make sure that post-apartheid South Africa would not be a cycle of revenge, but a way of trying to look forward and just saying, okay, the nation we want to become is what is going to dictate the actions that we are going to take, and not the past. It was very hard, and I guess South Africa, I believe you know this better than everybody else, is not out of that yet. And I understand that younger generation is quite impatient with Ubuntu. They think, okay, let's go out with your Ubuntu. We are talking about the apartheid that is still on because of this or that. But that was how it was constructed. And that construction led to the fact that now it is a global concept. Even people who do not speak any Bantu language are using it, because it has now the meaning of transitional justice. How do you administer justice, not to punish what happened, but to try to go beyond what happened? How do you do after a genocide? The only way out of a genocide is probably Ubuntu. That is what Rwanda tried. That is what South Africa did. And this is what I call construction of concept from a banal word. The word is just a word. I mean, now people are being very obscurantist and saying, oh, in Bantu language it means this or that. It is just like any other word with a very large semantic field. Now, it's the conceptual philosophical precision came from the fact that it was reworked, so to say, to tackle a problem, post-apartheid, and deal with it. And that is why I call it a construction of concept. The word intuere in Latin only meant to see, to look, to see. And it became intuition when it was built, constructed by philosophers, particularly Descartes, as such. From seeing, it became having an immediate apprehension by opposition to deduction, which is, going through mediation and so on. And that is the way in which philosophy, because philosophy is not a different language. I mean, philosophizing in German is to keep speaking German. But the words that you use, if they are concepts, are different from the usual language and the usual meaning. But they are still German words that even I could understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I have at least one question online, and okay, then Deborah comes second. And first, I have one here by Zoe Bohlmann on the chat. Might have touched upon that already with the last comments. It's a bit a question whether we got too liberal, too open-minded. And so on the current discussion, Zoe writes, Anke criticized the focus on the transmission of ideas and concepts in philosophical thinking while ignoring other forms of expression like dance, art, and creation of objects. Anke ended her point on the question of what is philosophy. Bachir says that philosophy is the construction of concepts. However, in culture we can construct definitely many concepts, poetic concepts, power concepts, hypothetical concepts, etc. I think in philosophy we try to think critically of concepts, distinguishing if and how concepts can make sense or not. So my question is, for you, can you clarify for what philosophy is for you? Also, is there a clear difference between philosophy and culture, or should there be one? And if yes, how would you describe it? Who likes to? Yeah, maybe go for the second one. Whether distinguish from culture, what's?
Okay, I just can give it a trial because the question which you are asking, which is of course a core question of all our doing in philosophy, and I think every philosopher already tried to give an answer, at least if you look into the history So I can also just only give a tentative answer. And by the way, it is very interesting to follow up with these different answers to the question what philosophy is, because it changed throughout the history, throughout the centuries, of course. And what we understand today by philosophy is completely different from what the ancient Greek philosophers, for example, understood by philosophy, where philosophy actually was really a practice to live a good life. Yeah. So I tried in my recent book, which Norman already mentioned, to give a definition of what philosophy is for me. And I think philosophy is a certain kind of movement of thinking, a way of thinking which always tries to take a distance from what is usually accepted as a given one. So philosophy is always trying to put things into question. Philosophy is asking questions. And Bachir also already mentioned the function of critique. And in my opinion too, critique is a big part or is an aspect of philosophical thinking. Namely, as I said already, putting the given into question and trying to open with this kind of thinking movement new horizons for thinking and for our life, for our relation to the world. This is what I would try to define as philosophy, and of course this is a big difference to culture, because culture is about many more aspects of life. But actually, I mean, I'm, as you said, also involved in this movement of intercultural philosophy in various functions, and actually we still don't know what culture is. Yeah, also we always discuss anew what we can understand by culture. It is a very fluent term actually. Culture is a very difficult term. Yes, please, your definition.
Very different from culture, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that the difference with culture is that philosophy is not an emanation of culture, otherwise it would not, and I agree with Anke, it's also a way of, having a critical distance vis-a-vis your own culture, questioning it. It has been done like this, people have thought this way, why is that the case? And questioning the beliefs that have been established, and that is why it cannot be the emanation of a culture. And in that sense, I understand the criticism of Souleymane and his insistence on the fact that philosophy, in a way, needs an author. The authorship is a way of saying, I take responsibility for this and these theses, and they may go against what was established and accepted by the culture. So this dissensus, so to say, is a philosophical stance and position.
Just add one sentence.
Yeah, sure.
I would not define philosophy, well, because I can't, but I will talk just briefly about the relationship between culture and philosophy. Kwasi Muredu, who actually I think the book was written with Huntunji, or at least was written in response to some of the critiques that they and Huntunji received. The title of the book I think is called Philosophy and African Culture, and where he draws the link between culture and philosophy, and one of the links that he draws is through language, and the idea that when one, and I think you spoke about this as well, when one philosophizes in, as you said, now European languages and now African languages, when one philosophizes in English, there are certain metaphysical assumptions that one makes that are based on the language structure of English and the culture of English. And then you are given into those metaphysical assumptions, but the moment you start to step back and think through those similar concepts in your own language, which of course the metaphysical assumptions of your discrepancy, and that is the beginning for Wiredu of a much more interesting in-depth philosophy, which he calls conceptual decolonization. And so, to that regard, I would say philosophy and culture, while not the same thing, are interlinked. And there's also a movement that has started, especially in Nigeria, that is sort of trying to reckon with to what extent is philosophy, or to what extent does philosophy owe its debt to the culture from which it emanates, or to the culture from which the problems come from, and the attempt is to muddy up the idea that one can achieve this distance from one's own culture, which whether one agrees or disagrees, there is that kind of blurriness when one considers the fact that there are certain concepts that arise that do not exist in other cultures, particularly because of how those different cultures are structured.
Okay, so I think we have one more question from Deborah, and then I think in terms of time we should then come to a close.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess I come over and.
Oh, all right. Okay. I think I can speak loud enough, but I will use the microphone anyway. So it's actually two questions. So the first one goes back to the role of women, the feminist perspective. And I think maybe also just partly to answer Norman's question, I think there's a book by Orality where she really talks, it's called The Invention of Women, so maybe it's also partly a response to what you said about women, about how Western feminists have invented the category of women. So it's a critique about that, but it's also a critique about this fixation on the visual and the disregard of the other senses. So she makes a very strong critique about that, and even suggests that we stop using the word worldview as our way of relating to the world, and use the word world sense, because it encompasses all the different senses. So in that way, I understand where you're coming from about the importance of authorship, especially now in the written tradition where women's writing in different disciplines is recognized. But then I also don't agree that the problem is really one of authorship. I would say the problem is really about, in this capitalist world where we live in, whereby, okay, how does the person who writes this get their benefits? Because it's what they earn, so the artist has to earn. While previously, the knowledge really was communal, it belonged to the community. So it was not private property, and it was mostly women. It was women who were custodians of this knowledge, and they passed it on to the child. That's also been written a lot in African feminism, that they were custodians of the oral word. So even the word mother tongue is coming from this idea that you learned your first words from your mother because you stayed with your mother and she told you these stories and she passed on all this knowledge. So it's coming from that. And so the idea of me being the originator of this idea and being the owner of it was not very important, because there are other ways of assigning privilege or benefits to the society. But now, of course, people want, of course, I can't get a job if I have not authored a book on my own. So I need the authorship anyway to earn money. So that is the problem. It's not that the problem is the authorship itself, but the benefits it brings. So I think that's how I would say it. And then the other question was a question of like the disciplines itself, how we need maybe to break the boundaries, because I know you've talked a lot about the definition of philosophy, but you've also discussed some people like Ngugi and their concepts, like orature, and you talked about Senghor. But yes, they are philosophers, but all these were also artists. They are poets, they are writers, they are chebes, how they work with the proverbs and created concepts out of them. So yeah, so it's just about how we have these boundaries between disciplines. But if we look at it, I mean, as a person who's studying, yeah, you have to study, like, you really have to study everything, like African art, you have to study African philosophy, everything, and then it comes all together. So how can we go on to break these boundaries between the disciplines?
interventions. You are right that in a society where there is no oppression of women or no exclusion of women from the knowledge production process, we maybe don't have to think about authorship. But where is this the case? Of course, I know Sieroka Oyewumi's book, The Invention of Woman, very famous book, widely discussed in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, but also contested. And I mean, one of the famous critiques is Bachir Yusuf, or just recently now, last year, Abosede Ibadiola published her book, Feminist African Philosophy, where she is also arguing against Oyewumi, saying that it is an illusion to think that there were no asymmetries between men and women also in pre-colonial times, and she is also from the Yoruba society and speaks Yoruba, and so far, I mean, there's a debate, yeah, there's a debate about it. Yeah, and so far, I don't know. I mean, we can say that every concept is just a product of a certain people or of humanity. Maybe it is not important to make the voices of women visible because they contributed anyway, we suppose. Coming from my background here in Europe, here at least it is important to reconstruct the contributions of women philosophers to the historiography of philosophy, because they have been actively excluded. And what we try now is to bring them back into the view. And I can imagine, or I mean, I discussed with many people, with many scholars, with many women philosophers from different regions of the world, from Africa too, but also from other regions of the world, from China, for example. Here, many people have the same concerns, that it is necessary to rewrite the history of women philosophers, because also in the very broad Chinese tradition of history of philosophy, which is centuries old, women almost didn't play a role, and it is time now to reconstruct the contributions of women philosophers to the history of philosophy. So this is my answer, but I understand your interventions, and there is still a lot of things to be discussed about these problems. The interdisciplinary issue, I give it to you. I hand it over.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly about the place of women. When you go back to what I was mentioning about the tradition of written erudition, actually, if you want to look at the philosophical production in either Arabic or what is known as Ajami meaning a language that is written with Arabic script but is not Arabic. And you have a very rich literature in Ajami in Africa, because as early as the 9th century or 10th century, actually these African languages were written using Arabic script. And one important contribution in the Hausa area of Nigeria, Niger, is Nana Asmao, who was the I think she was the niece or the granddaughter.
No, she was the daughter.
The daughter, direct daughter of
Osman
Osman Danfodio,
yes.
for example. That is very important to and her contribution is just paramount, actually. And you're absolutely right, reminding us that philosophy, these thinkers, like Senghor, express themselves most in poetry as well, and we should not be separating poetry, the poetic language, from philosophy, because of the reason I mentioned earlier. Sometimes poetry as the genre of allusion would be better fit when it comes to expressing something that is hard to explain in analytical language. Actually, all mystical traditions, mysticism in all religions usually prefer the language of of poetry as being more precise than the language of prose. More precise, paradoxically, in a very contradictory way, because precisely you can just allude to things, point toward them, rather than try to say them, which will become impossible. One of the authors I've written about, Muhammad Iqbal, this reformist Islamic Muslim thinker, is a great poet, just as like Senghor. And most of his philosophy is expressed in his poetry rather than the work he wrote in prose. Or Nietzsche, for that matter. I mean, the Zarathustra of Nietzsche is more poetry than prose. I guess there is a point where the highest form of philosophy might be poetry for that reason. So thank you for reminding me of that and of this other language of